Yeah, absolutely. What else do we have on today's teaching, on today's Bible study? What else do we have? What other information can we bring forward to enlighten people today?
I think for me, one of the interesting questions is how we approach Scripture, what questions we take to it. Mm-hmm. And certainly I know that in my evangelical days, my questions were all about historicity. What happened? What really happened? What can we prove? Because then we can build our argument for Christianity on that. Mm-hmm. And so the historicity of Christianity is something that's always discussed if you go on an alpha course or if an evangelist is preaching to you. But one of the challenges of that is we do not have any contemporaneous report. If we're going to the stories of Jesus, mm-hmm. we have no contemporaneous report on Jesus other than what is in the Christian documents. So mm-hmm. the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the extra canonical Gospels. Mm-hmm. So how can we confirm that information? We might look for internal consistency. Do they validate each other? And to an extent they do, and to an extent there are some very surprising contradictions. So that internal consistency is a question mark. But then when you look for external corroboration, there's nothing.
Yeah.
We are 1 degree removed from it. We can get back to writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny, Josephus, and they were all writing in the sort of 100s sort of period, and they're talking about the practice and beliefs of the primitive Christians. So we can get back to there, but what we don't have is local reportage from the time. I saw Jesus down the street today, did an amazing rally, some people got healed. There's nothing like that, no Roman records relating to him. And so there's this big question mark over the historicity of Christianity. So that's why there's a bit of debate around that. People often ask me, do I believe in an historical Jesus with the lack of that evidence? And I do personally, because I think it's easy to track how the Roman Empire hijacked and then distorted the Christian story.
Yes.
And I don't think it would have needed to do that if there wasn't an authentic Jesus story prior that was inconvenient to the empire.
Yeah.
So that makes me very confident that there really was a Jesus and an original Jesus tradition. But historicity was not the be-all and end-all to the early Christians. So if you go to someone like Justin Martyr, who was martyred for his faith, his big argument was not our stories are history and yours are rubbish. His argument was, you talk about figures in your stories, you Romans, you Greeks, you talk about resurrection, you talk about ascension, you talk about sons and daughters of Zeus. You need to let us make the same claims for our Jesus. Thank you very much. We're not saying anything new. Yeah. We just want to say about our Jesus what you're saying about your figures. That's very different from the argument for historicity that a lot of apologists are interested in today. Yeah. So I think if you're looking for historicity, then you tend to focus all your interest on the earliest Gospels and the canonical Gospels, the one that cohere with orthodoxy, whereas my interest is a little bit different to that. I like to go even earlier than that, to the very earliest sources. And so a lot of scholars believe the Gospel of Thomas is probably the earliest Gospel. And I think there are form analytical clues in the text that's what you're looking at. It's not finessed. It's not accommodated to other Gospels. It's not accommodated to orthodoxy. It's primitive document. We have Thomas. We have Q, which is the common written source used by Matthew and Luke. And we have the original version of the Gospel of Mark. And you can find the original version in the Codex Sinaiticus.
Yeah.
The Gospel of Mark is there, but there's no resurrection narrative.
Correct.
So in Thomas, Q, and Mark, you've got sayings, and in Mark, deeds as well, but no resurrection narrative. And that tells us that there were communities of faith producing literature for whom that was not a central part of the story, which I find very intriguing. So I love going back to the beginnings, looking at what primitive Christianity was before the orthodoxization began. But then I'm interested in how it developed as well. So I'm interested in the other Gospels, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, Pistis Sophia, texts like that, because they tell me what other Christian communities were thinking, what their beliefs were about Jesus. And some of these are pretty early. I mean, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the earliest fragment of that is earlier than the earliest fragment we have for the Gospel of Matthew.
That's a fact.
So it's not that they're much, much later. They're very, very close in time, written in the 200s. And they tell us what Christians believed at that point, what their wisdom teachings were. And if I'm going to those texts, I'm going with different questions. I might be going with wisdom questions as well. If I'm looking for teachings about ascension, how to evolve, how to become more than I am, those texts really major on questions like that.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes it's easy to talk at cross purposes because people's interest in the Bible is different. Some want to prove history. Some want to prove orthodoxy. I'm interested in what the early Christians believed and what wisdom they have for me to take away. So I think that it's worth acknowledging that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are different perspectives and different perceptions and even different agendas based on the person that's trying to interpret the text. And so people will look at different versions and claim that, some cases people will claim they always have the right version of the story, or that their telling of it is accurate. But as I'm now talking to you, I'm realizing that there's many different versions and many different interpretations, and even different eras of time where the stories have been written. And you can get sometimes, like you say, a more clearer view when you go deeper into the past, which is why I love studying ancient texts and tablets, because you're going far beyond what anyone else has taken and utilized for a base. And sometimes I think that gets you as closer to the truth as possible.
Yes, I mean, I'm interested in the kaleidoscope of theology that was Christianity in the beginning. I'm very, very familiar with orthodoxy. That was my world for a very, very long time. But I've always been curious to know, well, what did the Christians believe before the canonization of the New Testament? What did they believe in the 200s? What did they believe in the 300s? And for many years, I taught courses in the history of Christian thought. And I think it's helpful for people to know Christianity hasn't always looked like it looks to us today. It too has evolved.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is really great confirmation for me, because this was the research that I had looked into. This was the research I had come up with, this information I had come up with, and the same concept of looking further back in time to get an account that I can see seemed to be untouched, unaltered, lack of agenda. And it's just incredible to get the confirmation from you. So thank you.
Well, I've always found this fascinating. I find you can go back to the Bible for a lifetime and keep finding new layers in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have a quick question in between all of this. A lot of people's perceptions are that the Bible may have been written in real time. In other words, somebody was following around Jesus and writing everything down, following Moses around and writing everything down in real time. What is your understanding through teaching that how this information was actually recorded for the parts that weren't remixed from ancient tablets and texts? How is it possible that people can be there to gather this information in real time?
Well, we do have some clues that we're not always looking at real-time reportage. So if we go back to the Old Testament, for instance, to the Hebrew scriptures, you'll find the name Yahweh, which became the Jewish name for God, although in my books I argue that's not what Yahweh meant in the beginning, that Yahweh was a particular individual, was an entity. And the name Yahweh appears very early in the Bible. It's there in Genesis 3 with the story of the fall, for instance, what Christians call the fall. And you might want to pause and say, wait a minute, this name wasn't revealed until the time of Moses. So that's ages after the action that's being described here. So how's the name in here? Mm-hmm. And what I love is that the Hebrew scriptures are very open. We are being shown that a writer after the time of Moses is retelling an older story, and so has imported the later name into the older text.